Hey everyone, this video today is going to cover sections 10.1 and 10.2. So looking at how muscles interact and make movement, and then the criteria that we use for naming said muscles. So when we talk about muscle actions and interactions, they actually have words that are attached to them. Think of these like vocab words. The three main functional groups are prime movers or agonists, antagonists, and synergists. If you think back to English class, some of these literary terms, you can think of your agonist as your hero, your antagonist as your villain, and then your synergist as like supporting characters. So your prime movers are going to be the majority or the muscle that's majorly responsible for producing a specific movement. Your antagonist is going to be the muscle or group that opposes or reverses that movement. And then you can think of each of the two of these as being on opposite sides of the joint from one another. So what one muscle group does, the other undoes. So if we take my favorite example, the bicep muscle. So our bicep muscle crosses the anterior side of our elbow joint and it makes elbow flexion. So its antagonist is going to be on the opposite side. It's going to be on the posterior side, and it is going to do elbow extension. So in this case, the antagonist is going to be our tricep muscle. So agonist, bicep, antagonist, tricep. In this same example, our synergists are going to help the prime mover. So in the case of a bicep curl, we have a brachioradialis and a brachialis muscle that lie underneath the bicep, and they are just going to add extra force to that same movement and assist it in any way that it needs. When we think of synergy, we think of teamwork and helping and being supportive, and that's exactly what our synergist muscle groups do. The subcategory of synergists is fixators, and the best way to explain these are to think about our scapular. So we know that our scapula is not necessarily attached to our rib cage by a joint specifically, but is held down by other muscles. So your rhomboids, trapezius muscles are all great examples of fixators and how they fixate the scapula onto the rib cage. They're basically stabilizers, which act to support as well. Another thing that we can infer by a position of a muscle is where it is in relation to the joint itself. So in this case, in your PowerPoint, we are looking at the pectoralis major muscle. So the pec major muscle crosses anteriorly across your shoulder joint. Anterior muscles are going to produce flexion. So in this case, it is going to produce shoulder flexion simply by being on the anterior side of a joint. Your bicep is also a great example of that. It's on the anterior side of our elbow joint, and it produces elbow flexion. Now, conversely, if something is on the posterior side of a joint, here we're looking at the latissimus dorsi or the lats. What they do is arm extension. So if you think about in the movement of shoulder flexion, the pec is the agonist and the lats are going to be the antagonist in this case. So they are going to do extension in the same way that our tricep, because it's on the posterior side of a joint, always think anatomical position. So it being on the posterior side of the joint is going to do elbow extension. Two additional movements that we've talked about previously are abduction and adduction. So we're looking at the deltoid muscle here. It is going to be on the lateral side of a joint. So if something is on the lateral side of a joint, it is going to produce abduction or abduction, or bringing it away from our body. I guess I should use this side. So it is going to do abduction. It is on the outside, the lateral side of our shoulder. Now, if something is on the medial side, so in this case, it is your teres major muscle, it is going to produce adduction, adduction. It's going to add it to the body. So you can see how just based on the position of a muscle on a joint, it is either going to support an action, it's going to do the opposite, and then we can tell which way that bone is going to be moving as well. So that being said, one muscle can act as a prime mover for one movement, an antagonist for a different movement, and a synergist for a third movement. So they all have the same capability. Not to say that all of them are going to do that, but they do have the potential to act as all three. Okay. Ways in which we name skeletal muscles. So there's a lot of different ways, but one is going to be its location. So the location on the bone or the body in which it is associated. So the great example here is going to be our temporalis muscle. So without even ever knowing where the temporalis muscle is, you know that you have a temporal bone on your cranium. So the temporalis is going to lay directly over that temporal bone. So super easy, just based on knowing your anatomy and knowing where the bones are. The muscle shape is also one way in which we name muscles. So the deltoid, or delt, meaning triangle in Latin, specifically addresses the shape of that muscle. So we know that our deltoid makes a triangle and comes to a point on our humerus. Muscle size is another way in which we name muscles. So the maximus, the minimus, and the longus, I'm sure you can think of great examples. Our glutes are one. We have a glute maximus, which is obviously the largest of the three. We have a glute medius, which is going to be in the middle, and the glute minimus, which is the smallest. We also have muscles, for example, a longus muscle. So that means it's going to be long. It's going to run on a parallel axis to that bone. The direction of the muscle fibers or the fascicle arrangement. So when we think of directions of these fascicles, I think a great example of this is going to be our abdominals. So our rectus abdominis muscle is going to run up and down. So it's going to run straight up and down or north and south. Those are the muscles that we typically think of when we think of a six-pack, because those are the ones that we can see running up and down. But we also have two other types of abdominal muscles. We also have a transverse abdominis. So this is going to run at a right angle. So we have rectus abdominis here. Transverse abdominis is going to run opposite of that. It is going to run east-west. And then finally, our oblique muscles are going to run at angles to this imaginary axis, or when we think about running straight up and down. So we have obliques running this way, and we have obliques running this way. So the direction of those muscle fibers or its fascicle arrangement is another way in which we name muscles. Number of origins is also one of the ways in which we name them. So our bicep, bi meaning two, has two origins. So it doesn't just start on one single bone. It has two different heads that have separate insertions, two different insertions. The same thing with our tricep. Our tricep muscle actually has three origins. The location of these attachments. So sometimes we name bones based on the point of origin and insertion. Origin going first and insertion coming in last. So a great example of this is our sternocleidomastoid muscle. That was a mouthful. Sternocleidomastoid. Okay, so it's going to attach our sternum and clavicle and also our mastoid process. So the sternocleidomastoid muscle is right, ooh, there we go, that guy right there. So it's going to start on our sternum. It's going to cross our clavicle, the cleido muscle, and then finally it's going to insert on the mastoid process, which is the little projection right behind your ear. So sternocleidomastoid. If you put all of those together, even if you didn't know where that muscle was, you may be able to infer where it is based on its location of attachments. And then our muscle actions. So sometimes they're named for the actions that they produce, whether it be a flexion or extension, or we call flexor or extensor group. So good example of this would be wrist flexors. So your wrist flexor group is on the anterior side medially, your wrist extensor group, they each have their own individual names, but it's usually easier to group them all together instead of picking them out one muscle by the other. So the wrist flexor group and wrist extensor group. But just to make things even more confusing, we can combine all of these criteria that we just named for one specific muscle. So the example that our book gives is the extensor carpi radialis longus muscle. And yes, that is an actual muscle in your body. So extensor, meaning that extends. The carpals or carpi means wrist in Latin. It runs on the radial side where the term radialis comes from, and it is a long muscle, so it's going to run the entire length of your forearm. So extensor, carpi, radialis, longus muscle. That was a mouthful. Okay. We're gonna stop there for today. This is gonna be a little short lesson, and I'm gonna pick up with 10.3 fascicle arrangements.